Hey guys, so you're going to laugh, but I tried 2 different times and read chapter 9 2 different times, and both times it wouldn't upload. I don't know if it didn't record or what the deal was, but this is my third time reading chapter 9. I'm kind of an expert on chapter 9. So, anyway, chapter 9 is called The Death Railway, and you remember that they're trying to build a railway from the east and west side of that island. And they're calling it the Death Railway because the people who are working on making the railway don't have enough food. They're living in horrible conditions and they often die while they're making this railway. Not good, right? So let's start reading and you can find out what happens. Chapter 9, The Death Railway. Life along the Death Railway was worse than anything we had faced before. There was less food, more work, and many more beatings. This time our guards were mostly Korean. So the other guards were Japanese and they were from Japan. And you can see how close Japan is to Korea. Here is Japan, this pink part right here. And then Korea is right here. Okay, so these guards were from Korea. They were forced to join the Japanese Imperial Army. They didn't want to be in the Japanese army, and then sent to this jungle far from the fighting. They were angry, and they took their anger out on the prisoners because they didn't want to be there either. The conditions were so horrible to live in the rainforest. We were awoken by the musical notes of a bugle the first morning at what the guards insisted was 7 a.m. It was really 4:30. But all of Japan's territories had to be on Tokyo time. Tokyo is a city in Japan, and there's different time zones. So even though they're not in that time zone, they have to be on that time. So that's why they're being woken up so early. The men were forced to work 12 or 14 or even 20 hours a day for their meager rations. Rations is how much food they're getting. A breakfast glob of a flour-like plant substance called tapioca mixed with water, a cup of rice for lunch, and a cup of rice for dinner. Sometimes there was a watery soup with leaves in it. Ugh. Men who were sick received almost nothing, which meant that they couldn't get better. Sick men who could sit up were given the job of catching flies because flies spread disease. If they didn't catch enough, they'd get no food. Being carried into the hospital hut almost always equaled death. There were a few British doctors who were also prisoners at the camp, but they had no medical supplies, so they couldn't really help the soldiers. Hunger pains kept us awake at night, as did the sounds of the jungle, buzzing insects, bellowing bullfrogs, screaming monkeys, trumpeting elephants, roaring tigers, and the squeals of wild pigs captured in the tiger's jaws. Our huts were made of palm leaves and bamboo poles, and the rats ran around freely. There was no place for the men to bathe and no soap to bathe with. Between the mosquitoes, the ants, the lice, and the mites, the men never stopped scratching. Neither did I. There were many different jobs on the railway, all of them backbreaking. The guards were always yelling, "Speedo, Speedo," forcing the men to work faster. Whenever the POWs didn't make their quota for the day or something broke, there were horrible beatings. The guards shouted orders no one could understand and then beat the men for not understanding, because remember, they speak in a different language. Sometimes they beat the men just because they were bored and wanted something to do. Despite the constant threat of the beatings, the men did what they could to sabotage the project. So sabotage means make it so that the project didn't work. Because remember, these prisoners of war don't want Japan to win the war. So they're trying to make the railway not work. They don't want them to have this railroad, because that will help the Japanese, and they don't want to help the Japanese. Truck engines were filled with banana mush, and sand was dropped into gas tanks so the trucks wouldn't work. Railway ties and spikes were laid into the earth that would soon fall away, and some of those ties were made of wood that was about to decay. So they did all these things to try to make the railroad not work. Getting caught meant death, but the rise in morale, how they were feeling, that came with a successful sabotage effort made it worth the risk. It made them feel good to hurt the railroad. Foraging or looking for food in the jungle was forbidden, but the men did it anyway. It's what kept them alive. Leaves, snakes, rats, nuts, berries, and even lizards were added to the men's dinner each night. While Frank worked, I stayed in the jungle nearby. I caught rats, snakes, and lizards to share with the men. Often Frank had to give me the signal to disappear when the guards were near. Whenever one came too close, my lip curled back in a snarl and a low growl built in my throat. I couldn't help it. No matter how many times Frank told me to be quiet, I could smell how mean the guards were and how much they enjoyed hurting my men. So Frank would give me the signal to just disappear, and I'd wait in the jungle until he said it was safe to come out again. Day after day was the same: hard work, hardly any food, beatings, not enough sleep. The men wondered if anyone knew where they were or if they had been completely forgotten. No one had ever received a letter from home. Once, in Glowgoer, the men were given postcards they could write on and send home, and then the guards made a great show of burning them in a campfire while they laughed. So all those prisoners of war were writing letters home thinking their family or their friends were going to get to read these postcards, and then the guards just threw them in the fire. Does the world think we're already dead, I wondered? Occasionally, we got good news that kept the men going. Somehow, the prisoners had put together a small, wireless radio from stolen bits and pieces. One of the POWs kept it hidden in his hollow, artificial leg, and the men listened to war news when they could. So, this man had a fake leg, and it was hollow inside, so they put the radio in his leg. That's pretty clever and pretty sneaky. In October 1944, we learned that the Japanese had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Americans. The news was whispered from camp to camp, POW to POW. So remember, we're the Americans. We've come into this war now, and we're helping to beat the Japanese. Hang on, the men told each other. Just hang on for a little while longer. Christmas came and went. The men were not allowed to sing carols, but we did get the day off and a little extra food. Then on January 10th, 1945, we got some real hope. An American bomber appeared in the sky. It had bombed Padang. The guards started carrying gas masks everywhere. They were frightened. We were hopeful, but worried at the same time. Will the Allies get here in time to save us, or will we die of starvation first? And remember, the United States are the Allies. So France, Great Britain, the United States, Soviet Union, and China were the Allies. Over the next few months, the work got harder and the guards got angrier. The angrier the guards got, the angrier I became. More than once, I tricked them into stopping a beating. When I spotted large game in the jungle, which is an animal, not a game, something to hunt that they could eat, too large for me to handle on my own, I'd bark for the guards and the men to come with their guns. They kept the best meat, but the men and I got a little bit. It was better than nothing. I learned that if they were beating one of the men, I could fool them into thinking game or food was nearby. By the time they realized nothing was there, I was long gone and the men were back to work. But sometimes I was just too angry for tricks. Sometimes I went directly after the guards. One day, one of my men dropped a tool down a small ravine. I was hiding in the jungle when I saw a guard start to beat him. I ran out of the bush and barked and snarled, standing between the guard and my man. The guard raised his rifle. "Go, girl!" Frank yelled. I saw a flash and dodged out of the way just in time before dashing back into the jungle. The guard then turned his wrath, or his anger, on Frank, and I thought I might have to go back to help him. But after a couple of blows, the guard gave up. It was hours before Frank thought it was safe to call me back again. I did my best to apologize. I dropped a rat in his lap and gave him my sorriest smile. "I'll be more careful," I promised. "I won't let them kill me to punish you." In March of 1945, a little fuzzy, we were moved from a new camp farther up the railway line, or to a new camp. Every day we had to risk our lives on a train commute across wobbly bridges and on the edges of steep cliffs and deep ravines. The men worked in chest-high water, so they were always in water, to cut railway ties. Leeches that are in water, and they suck to your skin, covered their bodies. Rations were reduced, and the guards forced the men to work faster and faster. Rest periods disappeared. Every day, more and more men died. Frank and I were skeletons, surviving on a handful of rice per day. Hunting became too difficult. The rats had disappeared, and I didn't have the energy to try to catch anything else because she's so skinny now. Everyone said that if Frank died, I would die too of a broken heart. And if I died, Frank would soon follow. "I'll do my best to keep you alive, my friend, and you do the same for me." 25 POWs in our new camp died in March. In April, the rations were cut again, so even less food, and our death rate more than tripled. 10 men died in one day. In May and June, things continued to get worse, but not all the news was bad. In May, the POWs learned that Germany had surrendered and the war in Europe was over. So remember, this is a world war, so it's going on all around the world. It started with Germany, okay? And Germany's in Europe. It's not over in Asia where the story takes place. But Germany was the main country that started the war, and they've surrendered. So the war in Europe has been won by the Allies. However, the war in the Pacific, where they are, is still going on. But that's really good news that Germany has surrendered. Those soldiers will be heading here now that we've crushed the Germans, the men told each other. Once again, they urged each other to hang on just a little longer. Soon, they whispered, soon. The news seemed to make the Japanese even more determined to finish the railway. At the same time, many men were assigned to dig trenches along the tracks. We're digging our own graves, they muttered, because all these bodies that are dying have to be buried somewhere. By July 27th, 1945, we had been working on the railway for a full year. Every day there were signs that the Allies were coming. We saw their planes almost daily, but what were they doing? Did they know we were here? We needed more than the sight of a plane every afternoon. We needed them. Down here, I wanted to bark at them. We're down here and we need you. There were rumors that the Allies had taken back the skies and most of the Pacific Islands, which would be good news because the United States is the Allies. Locals, Sumatras, from Sumatra, started flashing their V for Victory signs right in front of the Japanese. Then in August, there was news on the radio of a powerful new American bomb dropped over Japan. And that was a big changing point in the war, that big bomb. Every day, Frank and I kept each other alive until the day we learned that I had been officially sentenced to death. So that does not sound good for Judy. Sentenced to death is not a good thing. So we'll find out what happens in chapter 10. Hopefully chapter 9 downloads and you guys can hear it. This will be my third time trying. So guys, remember, if at first you don't succeed, try again. All right, I'm going to try to download it for the third time. Hopefully the last. Hopefully it works.